Welcome back to Gospel Mysteries. In part 1, the prophets gave us a Messiah who reigns forever, and a Messiah who is cut off and has nothing. One person, two missions, no explanation. It is tempting to think the prophets introduced that tension. They did not. Moses had already built it into the law. This is part 2 of 3. Isaiah's suffering servant, Daniel's Messiah cut off. It is easy to assume the prophets added something new to Israel's expectation. They were not inventing a theology, they were expanding a pattern. Their prophecy surprise us only because we read them apart from Moses. The prophets never did. They built on the foundation he had already laid. Jesus told the religious leaders why.
Moses wrote concerning me.
He did not mean that Moses named him again and again. He meant that Moses built the framework in which the Messiah's mission could finally be understood. The law was never merely a legal code for a nation's life. Every institution inside it anticipated something beyond itself. Before any prophet described a suffering servant, Moses had already established the order. Redemption before inheritance, sacrifice before glory, mediation before dominion. The pattern is laid down almost immediately after the fall.
The seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head, and the serpent will bruise his heel.
We celebrate the verse as the first promise of redemption. Its structure deserves the same attention. Victory does not happen apart from suffering, it happens through it. The conqueror is first the wounded one. Moses does not say how the seed will suffer. He does not say why the suffering is necessary. But the sequence is already fixed. God's victory over evil will not come by going around suffering, but by going through it. Every act of redemption that follows quietly repeats it. Nowhere is the pattern more visible than the Passover. Israel's freedom did not begin with Pharaoh's defeat. It began with the death of a lamb. Before Israel could march toward the promised land, blood had to be on every door. Deliverance rested not on Israel's strength, but on God's appointed sacrifice. We overlook the order because we already know how the Exodus ends. But Moses records it carefully. Egypt is left behind only after the lamb dies. The wilderness begins only after judgment passes over those sheltered by the blood. Canaan lies beyond redemption, never before it. The order is remarkably consistent. Sacrifice comes first, glory follows afterward. The Levitical system says the same thing again and again. Every morning, another sacrifice rose from the altar. Every evening, another. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest carried blood into the most holy place for the whole nation. Year after year, the ceremonies continued without interruption. Not because they had achieved their purpose, because they had not. The repetition itself was part of the revelation. If one sacrifice had finally removed sin, another would never have been required. The continual offering of blood testified that something greater still lay ahead. The law addressed Israel's covenant life faithfully, and at the same time, it confessed its own incompleteness. Every altar pointed beyond itself to a redemption that had not arrived. So this was never merely ancient religious practice. Moses was constructing a prophetic pattern. Reconciliation always comes through substitution. Forgiveness always demands atonement. Fellowship with a holy God cannot be restored apart from sacrifice. Israel's leadership carries the same progression. Under the law, priest and king were deliberately kept apart. Priests came from Levi, kings came from Judah. No one was permitted to hold both. Where that line was crossed, judgment followed. The separation was itself part of God's instruction. And yet, hidden in Genesis, there is a man who is both. Melchizedek, priest and king. Moses explains almost nothing about him and lets him disappear as suddenly as he came. His brief appearance would mean little, except for what David does with it centuries later.
A priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek.
The implication is profound. Before the Messiah openly reigns as king, he must first finish a priestly work no priest in Israel could complete. Moses plants the seed, David sees what it is. Only later does the picture emerge. The most remarkable thing in Moses' writings may be this: Israel's own history follows the same pattern. Redeemed from Egypt by the blood of the Lamb, carried through the wilderness, brought at last into the inheritance promised to Abraham. Redemption, pilgrimage, inheritance. That is the rhythm of Israel's story from beginning to end. It is too deliberate to be an accident. The history itself becomes prophetic. God is not only delivering a nation from slavery, He is establishing a pattern that will one day explain His Messiah. The road to inheritance always begins with redemption. The kingdom is never reached by going around sacrifice. Once you see it everywhere in Moses. Abraham receives the promise after he offers Isaac. Joseph goes down into humiliation before he is raised to save the nations. Israel passes through affliction before it enters rest. The same lesson, taught again and again, until history itself becomes a form of prophecy. By the time the prophets began to write, the foundation was already laid. Isaiah's suffering servant did not appear in isolation. Daniel's cut-off Messiah was not a new idea. Zechariah's humble king did not stand apart from what came before. Each prophet simply drew another line on a portrait Moses had begun centuries earlier. So the law is not a collection of commandments. Beneath its ceremonies and its stories runs one coherent testimony, moving toward one revelation. Moses never announced that the Messiah would come twice. He simply established the sequence that made it necessary. Sacrifice before glory, priesthood before kingship, redemption before inheritance, not scattered observations, the architecture the prophets would build on. By the end of Moses' writings, the reader has learned far more than a nation's history. He has met a pattern that quietly governs how God redeems. But the one who will finally embody it is still concealed. The sacrifices continue, the priests continue, the promises continue. Everything points forward, nothing arrives. The prophets will add remarkable clarity to the portrait. Even they will not resolve it. They will describe the suffering, they will proclaim the glory, and they will leave the relationship between them unexplained. The key that unlocks the Old Testament still lies ahead, waiting for the one who alone could open the scriptures and show that every pattern, every promise, and every shadow had always been speaking of him. That is where Moses leaves us, the pattern complete and the one who fulfills it still hidden. In part 3, the prophets take it up, and the mystery finally has a name. If this opened the scriptures for you, subscribe and stay with us for the last part. There is more like this on the channel.